She walked into the police station and never came out. Her name erased, her pain denied. But what's more terrifying? The silence of those who watched. This isn't just history, it's a system built on fear. What if I told you they're still protecting each other? The rain came down hard that evening, drumming on the tin roof like a warning. Thick southern air clung to everything's skin, breath, memory. Clara Monroe stood on the creaking porch of her modest wood frame home, eyes fixed on the dirt road that vanished into fog and shadows. She held a blood-stained handkerchief in her palm, soft, faded pink, with tiny white flowers embroidered at the edge. It belonged to Sarah Bell, or at least it used to. The girl was gone now, not moved, not missing, gone. No one said the word, but everyone knew what it meant in a place like East Haven, Mississippi, in 1940. When a young black girl disappeared, there were only three options: the river, the woods, or a lie that kept her silent forever. Clara squeezed the fabric tighter, her knuckles whitening. She had seen too much blood for a woman who had spent her life bringing babies into the world. And yet, some wounds had nothing to do with childbirth. They were the kind you didn't talk about, not if you wanted to keep breathing. Earlier that day, she had tended to a woman barely in her 20s. The girl showed up just after dawn, shoes muddy, eyes distant. She didn't give a name, didn't have to. The pain on her face screamed louder than any words could. There was a tear, deep and raw, bruises on her wrists, and silence that wrapped around her like a noose. Clara had asked gently, "Who did this to you?" The girl just stared at the floor. When Clara reached for her coat, something slipped from the girl's worn leather bag, a crumpled piece of paper, stained at the corner. Clara picked it up. Room 4, no window. They come at night. She froze, her breath hitched. Her chest tightened as the memory slammed into her like a gust of wind through an open door. It had been 5 years. 5 years since she stood outside street, Agnes Hospital, holding her 12-year-old daughter, Elise, as she gasped for air. Pneumonia had stolen her strength, but the hospital had stolen her life. The nurse, white, lips pursed like a hymn book, refused to admit her. "Colored children don't get priority," she'd said. "You'll have to wait." Elise had died in Clara's arms on that front step. She remembered the warmth leaving her daughter's fingers. She remembered screaming into the sky until her voice broke. And she remembered the silence that followed like a heavy blanket over a grave. That same silence sat across from her now, in the eyes of that broken young woman. Clara stood up from the exam table, wrapped the girl in a shawl, and helped her to the back door. She never asked her name again. She didn't have to. The girl was just another page in a story. Easthaven refused to read. But Clara had learned to read between the lines. Later that night, as the rain thickened and the lights flickered, Clara moved through the house with a heaviness in her chest. In the corner of her bedroom, she pulled open a wooden box, the one she hadn't touched since Elise's funeral. Inside were photos, an old Bible, a Sunday dress no longer worn, and tucked between the pages of a hymnal was something she hadn't expected, a worn, leather-bound notebook, Sarah Bell's. She'd almost forgotten she had it. Sarah had left it in the church pew after choir practice, months ago, before she disappeared. No one came looking for it. And back then, Clara hadn't dared to open it. But now silence felt like betrayal. She flipped through the pages, careful at first, then faster, breath quickening. The words were shaky, disjointed. He said, "I stole something." They laughed, tied my hands, said I needed to be corrected. Deputy H watched the whole time. Clara stopped. Deputy H, Deputy Harlan Briggs. He'd been patrolling East Haven since before her daughter died, charming to white folks, smiling through clenched teeth at black children, his badge always polished, his boots always dirty. And Sarah. Sarah had been seen in the back of his cruiser the night she vanished. Clara's heart pounded like the rain on the roof. She closed the notebook slowly, like she was tucking away a ghost. Outside, thunder rolled low across the fields, and something rustled near the steps. She opened the front door and gasped. Hanging from the porch rail, soaked but unmistakable, was a strip of white cloth tied in a loose knot. A message, plain as day. A warning. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just whispered 3 words into the storm. Not this time. The storm had passed by morning, but the air still felt heavy, like the clouds had left behind their weight. Clara sat at the kitchen table, the leather-bound notebook in front of her. She hadn't slept. The coffee pot steamed quietly on the stove, its scent doing little to calm the storm still raging inside her. Her fingers hovered over the cover, tracing the rough edges of the worn leather. She took a breath and opened it again. The handwriting inside was delicate but tense, the strokes inconsistent like someone writing in fear or while watching the door. March 2, 1940. They said I took something. I told them I didn't. They smiled like it didn't matter. They took me anyway. Clara blinked. March 3. He said he was going to teach me a lesson. There was a room, small, no windows, white walls like a hospital, smelled like bleach, and something else like metal and sweat. They tied my hands, said I was lucky they didn't take more. Clara's grip on the pages tightened. March 4. Deputy Harlan was there. He didn't touch me, but he watched. Didn't stop them, didn't blink. He lit a cigarette and smiled while I screamed. She couldn't read anymore. Her eyes stung. Her stomach turned. She pressed the notebook closed, then slowly stood, walked to the sink, and splashed cold water on her face. The knock came 3 times. Soft but sharp. She dried her hands quickly and opened the door. Mama Jo stood there, wrapped in her usual faded green shawl, a woven basket in hand. Her silver hair peeked out from under a scarf, and her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned Clara's face. "Girl," she said, without waiting for an invite, "you look like you've seen a ghost." Clara stepped aside. "I think I read one." Mama Jo set the basket on the counter and lowered herself into the chair, like she was settling into a truth she'd been holding for too long. "I heard about that girl," she said quietly. "Sarah Bell, pretty child. Used to buy tomatoes from me every Sunday." Clara sat across from her. "You think she ran away?" Mama Jo didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a folded piece of cloth from her pocket and laid it on the table. It was another strip of white cotton, tied into the same loose knot as the one Clara found on her porch. "They used to do this back in my mama's time," she said, "before they came with torches or ropes. It's how they warned you, gave you a chance to shut up before things got ugly." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Why me?" Mama Jo gave her a long, tired look. "'Cause you know, and they know you know." Clara leaned back, heart pounding. "Then I can't just sit here. I need to speak up, do something." Mama Jo's eyes flashed. "Be careful. Speaking up in this town's a lot like walking barefoot through a snake pit. You might make it through, but not without scars." Clara hesitated. Then she stood, walked to the shelf above her fireplace, and pulled down a small metal box. Inside were old church programs, letters, and at the bottom something she hadn't touched in years, a folded sheet of paper listing the names of young black girls she delivered as a midwife. She unfolded it, scanning the names. Sarah Bell was there, and so was Elise Monroe, her daughter. But then her eyes caught something. 2 other names, both circled in red pencil: Janice Carter, Ruthie Daniels. Both girls had gone missing within the past 2 years. Both had been called in for questioning over petty theft. Neither returned, and suddenly, Clara remembered something else. The night Janice disappeared, Deputy Harlan had shown up to the church social. His shirt had been untucked, his boots muddy, and he was whistling. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for Sarah's notebook again. She turned the pages faster now, skimming. March 5. "He said I could leave if I didn't tell anyone. Said if I spoke, they'd come from my mama. Said I'd bring shame to my whole kind." March 7. "I tried to write a letter, but I burned it. I don't want them coming here. I'll just disappear." "Maybe that's safer." A tear slid down Clara's cheek. She wasn't just reading a diary, she was holding the slow erasure of a human life. Word by word, Sarah had written herself out of the world. And Clara refused to let that happen. She snapped the notebook shut, grabbed her coat, and stormed out the door. The town was quiet. The sky was overcast, heavy with more rain. She walked past the church, past the school, and straight to the modest brick building that housed the East Haven Sheriff's Office. When she entered, the room went still. Deputy Harlan stood behind the desk, a mug in his hand, mid-sip, his eyes locked onto Clara like a wolf spotting movement in the brush. "Well, Miss Monroe," he drawled, setting the cup down slowly. "Ain't this a surprise?" Clara took a step forward. I want to talk to the sheriff. He raised a brow. About? She met his gaze. About Sarah Bell and every girl like her. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Deputy Harlan smiled, not with his mouth, but with his eyes. That cold, empty smile that said he wasn't afraid. That said he'd done this before. The sheriff's out, he said, reaching for a pen. But you can leave a message. I'll wait, Clara replied, folding her arms. He nodded slowly. Suit yourself. She sat down in the far corner, clutching the notebook like a shield. And as the clock ticked on, she noticed something on the bulletin board across the room. A photo, blurry, but the face, unmistakable. It was Ruthie Daniels, smiling, holding a basket of apples. The caption read, Last seen March 1939. Case closed. Clara blinked. Case closed. The room tilted, not from fear, but from clarity. They weren't just ignoring the crimes. They were closing them, burying them in plain sight. Clara stood up slowly, holding Sarah's diary against her chest. Her voice was calm, but sharp enough to draw blood. I'm not leaving. Not until someone listens. And for the first time, Harlan's smile faded just enough to show his teeth. Clara knew then he wasn't the only one watching her. But she also knew this. Silence was no longer an option. The clock at the sheriff's office ticked louder than it should have. Clara sat stiff in the chair for nearly an hour, fingers wrapped tightly around Sarah's notebook, eyes darting between the door and Deputy Harlan's desk. He pretended not to notice her, but his silence wasn't the kind that ignored. It was the kind that waited, the kind that watched. At last, Sheriff Wallace strode in, middle-aged, barrel-chested, with a mustache so sharp it looked like it could slice a man's throat. His uniform was crisp, boots polished to a mirror. He gave Clara a slow once-over. Well now, Miss Monroe, he said, setting his hat on the counter. Didn't expect to see you here today. Clara stood, her voice steady. I need to report something. Is that right? He replied, nodding toward his office. Let's talk. She followed him into the back. The office smelled like stale tobacco and polished wood. Certificates lined the wall, one from the local Masonic Lodge, another from a hunting association. A deer's head watched them from above the filing cabinet. Clara stayed standing. I've been delivering babies in this town for 15 years, she began. I've seen more than my share of pain. But what I saw this week, she pulled out the notebook and placed it on his desk, is not just pain, it's evil. Sheriff Wallace didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. Evil's a big word, Miss Monroe. Clara didn't flinch. You have girls going missing. Girls who come back broken. If they come back at all, they're being taken to some room. No window smells like bleach. That's what this girl wrote. And she names a deputy. Wallace glanced past her to the door. Which one? Harlan, Clara said plainly. A pause. The sheriff let out a long sigh, then chuckled like she just told him the rain was racist. Deputy Harlan Briggs has been with this office 17 years, he said. Decorated. Respected. Got folks in town who say he's practically family. He's also a monster, Clara snapped. You got proof of that? He said, finally tapping a finger on the notebook. This a confession? A signed statement? Anyone see him do anything? Clara stared at him, her breath catching. You think these girls are making it up? I think people write things when they're scared, or confused, or want attention. Her eyes narrowed. You think Sarah Bell disappeared for attention? He stood abruptly, the chair creaking back. I think what you're doing is dangerous. Dangerous? You come in here waving accusations, naming names, stirring things up in a town that's already fragile. You got a reputation, Miss Monroe. Midwife, woman of the church. Don't throw that away for rumors. Clara's voice dropped into something cold and sharp. This isn't a rumor. This is a pattern, and you know it. He walked to the door and opened it, motioning her out. If you find real evidence, you come back. Until then, I suggest you forget this little diary and focus on helping people the way you always have. Quietly. She didn't move, so he leaned in, voice low and full of teeth. You dig deep enough, Miss Monroe. You might find yourself buried too. Clara stepped out. The front office was empty now, except for Harlan, who stood by the window, smoking. He watched her with a look that wasn't quite a smirk, but too confident to be concerned. As she stepped out into the street, the sky had darkened. A storm was building again, and in that moment, Clara realized something that shook her more than any threat. They weren't ignoring the evil. They were protecting it. Later that afternoon, Clara sat at Reverend Elijah's modest church office, the notebook open between them. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, slashing the room into light and shadow. Elijah was a tall, slender man in his 60s, with thoughtful eyes and a deep, patient voice. He turned the pages slowly, like each line was sacred. "I've heard whispers," he admitted. "Some of the women after choir. During communion, they start to speak, then stop, like something's pulling the words right out of their throats." He slid the diary back toward her. "You're not wrong, Clara, but you are alone." "No," she said, voice firm. "Not anymore." She reached into her bag and pulled out a smaller notebook, one she'd started that morning. Inside were names, faces, dates, 9 girls. Janice Carter, Ruthie Daniels, Eva Simmons. And now, Sarah Bell. "What if we collected more stories?" she asked, anonymously. "Protected. We record them, save them, build a pattern they can't ignore." Elijah hesitated. "If we do this, there's no going back." Clara looked him in the eye. "There's already no going back." That night, she returned home to find a manila envelope tucked beneath her door. Inside was a photograph, black and white, blurry. It showed the back of a patrol car. A girl young, hair wild, pressed against the window from the inside. A date written on the corner, March 1939. There was no note, but Clara didn't need one. The message was clear. They knew she was digging. They were watching. She lit the stove and tossed the envelope into the flame, but not before slipping the photo out and hiding it beneath her floorboard. The next morning, the knock came early. It wasn't a neighbor or a patient. It was a man in a gray suit, clean-shaven, briefcase in hand. "Miss Monroe," he said. "Name's Sterling, state investigator. I'd like to ask you some questions." Clara raised a brow. "State?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, offering a badge. "Seems someone's been sending letters. Anonymous tips. Some very serious allegations about this town." Clara hesitated, then stepped aside. "Then come in, Mr. Sterling." He nodded. "Thank you. Just so you know, the sheriff's already been informed, but I'm not here on his behalf." Clara offered a tight smile. "Good, because I'm not here on his side." As he sat and opened his briefcase, Clara glanced toward the window. The storm was finally here, but she wasn't afraid of thunder anymore. She was learning to speak lightning. The next 2 days passed like the slow tightening of a noose. Word traveled fast in East Avon, especially when it wanted to. It didn't matter that no one had seen Clara's meeting with the state investigator. It didn't matter that she'd said nothing publicly. All it took was a look, a whisper, a side glance at the market, and suddenly, Clara Monroe became a name said in hushed tones and spit out with contempt. The first sign was her front gate. Someone had scrawled the word traitor in red chalk, just bold enough to stain, just faint enough that no officer could be bothered. Then the grocer, Mr. Thomas, who used to save her a bag of ripe apples every Thursday, said he didn't have any left, even though she could see them behind him, stacked high and untouched. By the end of the week, 2 of her clients canceled appointments. No reason given, just canceled. Saturday morning, Clara was arrested. No sirens, no spectacle, just 2 officers at her door, formal and cold. "Miss Monroe, you're being detained under suspicion of spreading false information and inciting unrest." Her hands didn't shake as they cuffed her, but inside her body screamed. They kept her in the holding cell for 48 hours. No charges, no lawyer, no explanation. Just the low hum of the fluorescent light above, the smell of mold, and the distant laughter of men who wore badges and spoke like gods. Deputy Harlan didn't speak to her directly, but he made sure to walk past her cell. Twice, both times slowly. The second time, he whistled a lullaby, the same one she used to sing to Elise. Clara closed her eyes and counted backward from 100. When she was finally released, Sheriff Wallace handed her a single line, "No formal charges, but I'd keep my head down if I were you." Outside, the sun had already set. The walk back to her house felt longer than usual. Her front door had been kicked in. The windows were shattered. Her photos of Elise, of her patients, of her mother were scattered across the floor, trampled and torn. And on the far wall, written in charcoal across peeling wallpaper, were 3 words, "Stay in line." She stood in the doorway, body still, eyes scanning the wreckage. And then she laughed, not loudly, not happily. It was the laugh of someone who'd been pushed so far past the line of fear that she'd circled back to rage. A dry, empty, of course, kind of laugh. Because if they thought this would break her, they didn't know what she'd already survived. That night, Clara made her way to the one place no one would dare follow, Mama Joe's house. Tucked behind the old cemetery, Mama Joe's small shack smelled of tobacco, cedar, and secrets. The porch creaked like a prayer when Clara stepped on it. Mama Joe didn't flinch when the door opened. She simply said, "I was wondering how long it'd take." Inside, the room was dim, lit by oil lamp. A pot of something warm simmered on the stove. Herbs hung from the ceiling like upside-down saints. Clara sat, arms wrapped around herself. "They broke into my home," she said quietly. "Tore everything apart. My daughter's photo, my clinic charts, even my hymnal." Mama Joe nodded slowly, pulling a quilt across Clara's shoulders. "They've done worse," the old woman said. "I remember when they dragged Mary Jenkins from her house and hung her in the pecan grove," said she tempted a white boy. "That boy was 9. She was 17. She was his nanny." Clara swallowed. "They do it in silence," Mama Joe continued, "because they know the silence is where they win. A scream can be heard, a name can be remembered, but silence? Silence dies with you." Clara looked up. Her voice cracked. "What if it's already too late?" Mama Joe didn't speak. She reached into an old tin and pulled out a notebook smaller than Sarah's, wrapped in linen. She handed it to Clara. Inside were names, 9 of them, written in the same hand, across 3 years. Every girl between 13 and 22, every one of them gone. Mama Joe pointed to the 4th name, Elise Monroe. The letters blurred as tears filled Clara's eyes. "She was sick," she whispered. "She had pneumonia. She had bruises too," Mama Joe said, voice soft but brutal. "You told me so yourself, remember? On her wrists. You thought she fell." Clara froze. No, she couldn't have. She didn't know. Or maybe she didn't want to know. And that was worse. A scream built in her chest but never left her throat. She closed the book slowly, her hands shaking. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Why didn't anyone stop them? Mama Joe met her eyes, tired and fierce. Because this town doesn't protect the living. It protects the lie. The next morning, Clara woke in Mama Joe's guest bed, surrounded by silence but not the kind she feared. This silence felt ancient, rooted, like the calm before something breaks open. She rose, dressed, and returned to what was left of her home. The neighbors watched through parted curtains. Some didn't look at all. She didn't speak. She just cleaned, one photo frame at a time. At noon, Reverend Elijah knocked. She opened the door, and he stepped inside with a manila envelope under his arm. "I spoke to Ruthie Daniels' cousin in Jackson," he said. "She says Ruthie came home once, shaken, couldn't talk, but she wrote something." He handed Clara a photocopy of a torn journal page. It read, "There's a room, always cold. They say it's justice, but I only remember the bleach and the mask." Clara stared at the words. Then she looked up, a fire starting to rise again. "No more waiting," she said. "I want every name, every voice, every girl they tried to bury." Elijah nodded. "I'll help." Outside, a boy rode by on his bicycle and tossed a rock at Clara's porch. It clattered harmlessly. He didn't even look back, but Clara did. She stepped onto the porch, picked up the rock, and placed it on her windowsill. Then she whispered, "You'll have to try harder," because she knew now this town wasn't broken. It was built this way, and she was done pretending it could be fixed with silence. By Sunday morning, the whispers were no longer enough. Clara stood in the back of Mount Zion Church, notebook in hand, eyes scanning every face as Reverend Elijah finished his sermon. The congregation was smaller than usual. Word of trouble traveled faster than the gospel, but those who remained were the ones who still believed in more than just survival. When the final hymn ended and the last amen echoed off the wooden beams, Clara stepped forward. Some turned to leave. She raised her voice before they reached the doors. "I need 5 minutes. she said, calm but resolute. 5 minutes for every girl who never got to speak. Silence. Then, slowly, people sat back down. Clara walked to the front. The sun through the stained glass painted her in red and gold, like fire and judgment rolled into one. She opened Sarah Bell's diary, read 3 lines aloud, then held up Ruthie Daniels' torn journal page, then pulled from her coat pocket a photograph, blurry, black and white, of the patrol car Sarah had last been seen in. "I know what you've heard about me," Clara said. "That I'm stirring trouble, that I've lost my mind, that I'm putting myself and others at risk. But if truth is dangerous, then what do you call what's happening in that room without windows?" She paused. Her voice cracked. "My daughter Elise. She didn't just die of pneumonia. I know that now. I was too afraid to see it then. But I won't be afraid now." The room was frozen. Even the air held its breath. Then, from the back, an old woman stood. Her voice wavered, but her words didn't. "They took my niece, Ava, 2 years ago. Said she stole a hairbrush. She never came back." Another voice. "My cousin had bruises too. Said she fell off her bike. Never looked me in the eye again." Then another, and another. Within minutes, a dozen women were standing, some sobbing, some trembling, some stone-faced but loud. Clara didn't cry. She simply nodded, taking each name down in her notebook, like sacred scripture. That night, the storm came back, and this time, it brought fire. Clara was asleep at Mama Joe's when the first bottle shattered against the church steps. Flames burst open like a scream no one could silence. Within seconds, the front door was ablaze. Someone had tossed another into the back. Petrol and rage don't ask questions. Reverend Elijah got out just in time. So did the caretaker. But the records? The journals? The confession letters they'd begun to collect? All gone, reduced to ash and smoke under a cross that once stood for grace. Clara arrived moments later, barefoot, running. She watched the fire dance against the night, orange licking the heavens like judgment reversed. Harlan stood across the street, not in uniform, but present, and smiling. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just smoked and watched her burn. By morning, national headlines hadn't come, but the Chicago Defender received a package. Inside was a new diary, handwritten by Clara Monroe. It contained names, dates, descriptions, patterns, and one line underlined in red. They call it justice. But justice doesn't come in the dark with bleach and rope. The editor called it the East Haven Files. He didn't wait to verify. He published them the next day. Clara didn't go into hiding. She opened her new clinic that Monday morning on the edge of town, in a repurposed shack that Mama Joe used to store herbs. There was no sign out front, no official hours. But by noon, 3 girls had come by, one with bruises, one with silence. One just needed someone to say, "I believe you." Clara said it every time, but East Haven wasn't done with her. Tuesday morning, she stepped onto her porch and found something waiting. A noose, tied neatly, hung from a nail on the front beam. Beneath it, a note. "You want justice? Come find it. Signed, Room 4. She didn't shake, didn't blink. She took the noose down, folded the note, and placed it in her pocket. Then she walked back inside and locked the door. That night, Mama Joe spoke softly across the dinner table. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" Clara sipped her tea. "They want me to be scared. And you're not?" "I am," Clara admitted. "But fear isn't what keeps me up at night." Mama Joe tilted her head. "Then what?" Clara looked her dead in the eyes. "The thought that another girl will be taken tomorrow, and no one will remember her name." Midnight came quietly, but Clara didn't sleep. She lit a single candle, opened her notebook, and began writing. Not a name, not a time, but a letter. To the next girl. To the one who would walk into that room. To the one who might not come back. She wrote, "They will tell you silence is safer, that no one will believe you, that your voice is small, but it is not. It is thunder. It is the crack in their mirror. Speak even if your voice shakes, especially then." She folded the letter, placed it in the center drawer of her clinic, and on top of it, she left a nameplate: Clara Monroe, midwife, witness, survivor. Because if the world wouldn't come looking for justice, she'd build it, one name at a time, And blood? Blood doesn't disappear. It stains. It remembers. And one day, it speaks. The morning after the fire, East Haven was unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that only follows something wicked when a town doesn't speak because it knows what it did. But Clara Monroe had no intention of going quiet again. She stood in front of what remained of Mount Zion Church, a blackened frame, windows blown out, the cross on the steeple hanging sideways like it, too, had given up hope. The smoke had cleared, but the stench of gasoline still hung in the air, thick as guilt. Beside her stood Reverend Elijah, holding a folder wrapped in cloth, rescued just moments before the flames took everything. "There's one thing they forgot," he said. "They can burn the words, Clara, but not the truth." Clara opened the folder. Inside were statements, fragments, scribbled notes from women who'd come forward before the fire. Most were unsigned. A few were almost illegible, but they shared a pattern. Same room, same smells, same threats, same silence. But now, something new. One letter ended with a name. He wasn't the only one. The man in the white coat watched too. Clara frowned. "A doctor?" Elijah nodded. "There's only one who works with the jail. Dr. Malcolm Leeds. Town physician, Rotarian, Sunday school teacher. The man who delivered half the white babies in East Haven for the past 20 years. She didn't want to believe it. But then again, belief had never saved anyone. By noon, another envelope arrived at Clara's clinic. No return address, no message. Inside, a photo. 3 men standing outside a building with no sign. Brick exterior, no windows. One of them was Harlan. The second was Sheriff Wallace. The third, Dr. Leeds. And scrawled on the back of the photo, in uneven handwriting, "Room 4 isn't just a room. It's a ritual." That night, Clara drove to the edge of town where the county archives were stored, a beige building. No one visited unless they needed land deeds or marriage licenses. But she wasn't looking for either. She searched arrest records from the last 5 years. Dozens of young black girls detained for petty theft, vagrancy, or disorderly conduct, most held for 24 to 72 hours. No court dates, no public defense. Clara ran her finger down the ledger until she stopped on a name she recognized, Ruthie Daniels. Picked up March 14, 1939. Released unknown. Across the margin, scribbled in red ink, transferred to medical custody. Her stomach dropped. Medical custody. It meant Dr. Leeds. She flipped through the next few pages, heart racing. 5 more girls. Same note, transferred, no follow-up, and no family ever told. The next morning, she stood outside Leeds' clinic. The white paint was fresh, the hedges trimmed. A cross hung in the window next to a sign that read, "Healing with Dignity since 1922. She walked in. The receptionist, a pale, thin woman with gray hair and eyes that refused to meet hers, offered a smile that didn't reach her mouth. "Miss Monroe," she said, her voice brittle. "Doctor's in session at the moment." Clara nodded. "I'll wait." The woman blinked. "He might be a while." Clara sat anyway, pulled out a notebook, wrote a single word on the first page, names. After 40 minutes, the door to the back opened. Dr. Leeds emerged tall, neatly dressed, smelling faintly of antiseptic and pipe tobacco. His smile was polished, but his eyes flickered the moment he saw Clara. "Well, Miss Monroe," he said, voice smooth, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" She stood, met him in the middle of the room, and handed him a copy of the arrest ledger. "I know," she said simply. Leeds didn't look down. "Know what, exactly?" "You're not just stitching wounds," she replied. "You're helping bury them." He gave the page a cursory glance, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his coat. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," she said. "It's a pattern. I have more statements, names, witnesses. And if you think burning a church erased them, you're wrong." He leaned in slightly, voice dropping low. "You're playing a dangerous game." Clara's voice didn't waver. "No, I'm building a reckoning." That night, another letter appeared on her doorstep. This one was typed, "Stop, or someone else will get hurt. The doctor can't protect you. The sheriff won't. And we don't miss twice." There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. Clara brought the letter inside, sat at her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Then, without flinching, she lit a match and set it ablaze, watching it curl into ash. She knew what came next. They'd come harder, louder, meaner, because now they were exposed. Now the illusion was broken. This wasn't just one bad man with a badge. It was a web, a system, a machine. And Clara Monroe was the wrench. By the weekend, her story had made it beyond East Haven. The Chicago Defender published part the second of the East Haven Files. Then came a short piece in the Pittsburgh Courier. A week later, the New York Tribune called, and people started saying the names: Sarah Bell, Ruthie Daniels, Janice Carter, Elise Monroe, not as rumors, but as victims, as daughters. Back in East Haven, the tension boiled. Church windows were smashed. The Reverend received a death threat. Mama Jo found dead chickens strung from her porch. But Clara kept writing, kept collecting, because she understood now this wasn't about saving the girls who had been taken. It was about stopping the next one, because the truth was bigger than room 4. Room 4 was just a symptom. The disease was the silence, the complicity, the way they all watched and did nothing. And maybe Harlan was the face of it, but he was never alone. He never had to be. Because when a town is built to look away, monsters don't hide. They stand in the light and smile. The first autumn wind blew into East Haven with a kind of warning, cool and sharp, like it came to strip illusions from trees and people alike. Clara Monroe stood at the edge of the town's cemetery, the notebook pressed tight against her chest. Beside her was a small wooden sign, unmarked, no headstone, no flowers. It was where they'd buried Sarah Bell, or what was left of her. She had no family left to mourn her, no ceremony. Just a quiet box, lowered beneath red dirt in the corner of a cemetery that didn't even write her name in the ledger. But Clara was there now, and she spoke her name soft but firm like an offering. Sarah Bell. Then she opened her notebook and read more names: Ruthie Daniels, Ava Simmons, Janice Carter, Elise Monroe. Each name sliced through the morning stillness, like a bell rung for the dead. And somewhere between the 4th and the 12th, Clara's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. She never would. The Chicago Defender had published the 3rd installment of the East Haven Files by then. It hit the national circuit, syndicated across black newspapers in New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta. An anonymous source, CM, had become a symbol of defiance, a whisper among civil rights circles, a ghost who refused to be quiet. And with every paper printed, with every voice that echoed back her truth, Clara could feel the ground beneath East Haven begin to shift. But so did the eyes that watched her. 2 days after Sarah's burial, a black sedan pulled into Clara's driveway. Out stepped a man in a press suit, badge clipped to his belt. "FBI, Miss Monroe," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Agent Langston. We've been reviewing some recent reports. Your file keeps coming up." Clara folded her arms. "Took you long enough." He didn't deny it. Instead, he opened his briefcase on her kitchen table and laid out photographs of room 4, of transport logs, of arrest records altered after the fact. "We've confirmed at least 4 officials involved in what we're calling a network of unlawful detainment and abuse," he said. "But it goes deeper. Some of these signatures go back 15 years. Clara stared down at the pages. Then she pointed at one photo, blurry but unmistakable: Sheriff Wallace, Deputy Harlan, Dr. Leeds, and a 4th man. Clara squinted. "Is that the Reverend?" Langston hesitated. "We believe so. Elijah Wright. He's been a long-time informant, feeds names to authorities in exchange for immunity. That includes information about women speaking out." Clara stepped back, as if the wind had been knocked from her chest. No, not Elijah, not the man who had stood beside her, published the first names, offered her his pulpit. But then, it all made sense. The night before the church fire, he'd insisted on locking up alone. The documents she thought were burned, only some were missing. And the night Mama Jo was attacked, he was away preaching. Clara lowered her head. Even the righteous could be purchased in East Haven. She didn't tell anyone, not yet. Because the truth was no longer just a weapon, it was a responsibility. Weeks passed. Sheriff Wallace retired early. Dr. Leeds was reassigned to administrative duties. Deputy Harlan vanished. No charges, no mugshots, no trials, just gone. Clara knew better. Men like him didn't disappear. They relocated. On the first Sunday of October, Clara reopened the clinic officially. There was no ribbon, no speech, just a brass plate nailed to the door. Clara Monroe, midwife, witness, voice. Inside, the walls were lined with files not of patients, but of testimonies. Anonymous letters, statements, newspaper clippings, police records smuggled from the inside. And above her desk, framed and centered, was a simple quote written by hand. They counted on our silence, but we learned how to speak. The final entry in Clara's notebook was not a name. It was a vow. If one more girl disappears, they will no longer look away. They will see her in every paper, every headline, every whisper, because now we know their names too. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a young girl knocked on Clara's door. She couldn't have been more than 12. Big eyes, mud on her shoes, a letter clutched in her hand. "My sister," she said. "She went missing last week. Mama says not to talk about it, but I think you'd want to know." Clara knelt beside her, took the letter, held the girl's hand. "Tell me everything," she said, and the girl did. Her voice shook, but it was loud enough. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. In the distance, church bells rang, and somewhere, beneath the soil of a town that chose to forget, a name began to echo, one after another, a litany of daughters, a gospel of the unheard. They had tried to erase them, but now, every name was a matchstick, and Clara Monroe was holding the flame. Because justice isn't a courtroom, it's remembering, it's resisting, it's saying the names. Until the world can't ignore them, we know your names, and we're not forgetting. And if this story shook you, even just a little, if it made you angry, heartbroken, or more aware than before, drop a number 1 in the comments right now. Let it be a small act of resistance, a way to say, I see them, I hear them, I won't forget them. Because the lesson here isn't just about the past, it's about what we choose to ignore today. Silence doesn't protect the innocent. It protects the powerful. And when we refuse to speak up, we become part of the cover-up. Don't let their names vanish again. Your voice matters. Use it.